30th anniversary.
Hot take.
I can't believe it's been 30 years already, because that makes it a very old system.
Yeah, and that makes us very old as well, because this came out after we were born.
Yes.
Yeah, that's very sad. I've been plucking hairs for years and stuff, and we're talking about the Game Boy today.
Yes.
The Game Boy is such an important, not just a handheld console, but a console in general.
Yeah.
The Game Boy was the first huge handheld gaming system.
It wasn't the first
No.
handheld gaming system, but that doesn't really matter when you consider that what the Game Boy eventually became was just so much more important.
Yeah, exactly. So we're celebrating the 30th anniversary of this wonderful little system. It came out in April of 1989. It was developed by a very special person at Nintendo who had been working at the company, I think, before they were really diving into games.
I think
right?
toys was most of
Yeah,
those.
yeah. So who is this gentleman?
Gunpei Yokoi.
Oh, boy.
Now, Gunpei Yokoi is one of the, I want to say, like, gods of gaming. When you think about the people that are most influential in the entire industry, his ideas and his philosophies help build what Nintendo is today. And what the Game Boy originally was designed as wasn't supposed to be a super high-tech piece of equipment that was using the bleeding edge of hardware. It was using things that were more off the shelf, things that you could get for cheaper so that they could make a piece of hardware that lasted a very long time.
Yeah, so that kind of set the foundation and the pace for Nintendo and hardware for years to come, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, the Game Boy, when it was released for relatively cheap, around $90 US when it was first out. But like you're saying, yeah, it was cheaper components, so we got the sort of like monochromish screen, the beautiful olive green or lime green screen, some people say. But this thing could take a beating,
Yes.
man. There was a Game Boy that was, you probably heard about this by now if you haven't, there was a Game Boy that someone took when they went and served in the Gulf War, and it exploded, or there was like a bomb that went off, this thing got fried, and they're still displaying it to this day with Tetris at like the Nintendo store in New York.
Yeah,
right?
they didn't swap out the Eternals. Just think about this. Even though it survived that, it still works today.
Yes.
The actual hardware in many Game Boys still work. The screens can be a little bit finicky. The connecting pins can be a little bit weird. But usually if you just clean them up, they still work pretty well.
Yeah, so many great games. Well, I want to talk a little bit about the launch titles. Alleyway was kind of a cool breakout sort of clone, right? With him, Mario was in the little,
I remember that well,
little
yeah.
thing. Baseball, tennis, whatever. Super Mario Land was huge, and I have my original Super Mario Land, actually. If you're listening here, I'm going to describe this to you. I actually wrote my name. You may not be able to see it. Very tiny, like 6-year-old Adam. 5 or 6-year-old Adam wrote his name on this Mario Kart. Obviously, I didn't realize how important game carts and collecting would be, and defacing a gem like this.
Yeah, well, game collecting really wasn't a thing back then.
Yeah,
right?
but Super Mario Land is a pretty neat game, and it was a decent launch title. It was doing something that the Game Boy did with a lot of Nintendo series, right? It was like, okay, let's bring that to the handheld. It's not the same hardware necessarily. It may be a little underpowered comparing it to the NES and, of course, the Super NES later on, right? But yeah, they would take franchises and bring them forward, and they weren't the same necessarily. So Super Mario Land, you'd be jumping on, the Koopas, and then they'd explode.
Yes.
Or you'd throw a fireball, and it would literally be a bouncy ball that would bounce around and stuff.
Because there was limitations to what they were capable of
Right.
doing. That version of Super Mario Land, by the way, designed by Gunpei Yokoi.
That's right.
That's actually, this isn't a Mario game that's designed by Shigeru Miyamoto, which
right.
most people are kind of shocked to learn about.
I believe Gunpei Yokoi also helped out quite a bit with Metroid 2, which was a really great game. We have to talk about one more launch title, though, before we finish the wrap-up of launch titles. A little important game you may have heard of. Tetris.
Yeah.
Tetris was a launch title not in Japan, but in North America.
Bundled for most people,
It
actually.
was.
Like, when you got the Game Boy, that became the thing you had. Now, this set a precedent for a lot of other
Yes.
companies to include a piece of software with their consoles. And it really mattered, because for many people out there, Tetris became one of the most important portable games of all time.
It was a phenomenon,
Yeah.
right? Like, everyone wanted to play this. I remember when I got my original Game Boy, it wasn't just me and my slightly older brother playing this thing. My mom and my dad were addicted to Tetris. They'd keep playing it. And, like, it's a game that, we first played it. Many of us first played it on the Game Boy, but it is timeless.
Yeah.
Right. What a beautiful way to first experience Tetris.
Now, I have kind of an interesting history with the
Yeah.
Game Boy. I did get a Game Boy Color. All my friends had Game Boys, and I used to go over to their houses and play Game Boys. Or the beautiful thing about the Game Boy was they could actually bring it to my house, and I could play it there. But what I ended up getting was this. A Game Gear.
Oh my gosh.
This is my original Game Gear.
Shane has a Game Gear. What's in your Game Gear, Shane?
Right now, Mortal Kombat 2. Kind of
Oh
fitting
my
'cause,
gosh.
Mortal Kombat.
That is the best version of Mortal Kombat
it's the
2.
worst
It is
version.
arcade perfect.
It's Mortal Kombat played with 2 buttons, folks.
Yep.
This
For
was,
10 minutes.
Yeah. This was probably at the time the biggest competitor to the Game Boy that ever
Absolutely.
existed. There was the Atari Lynx. There was like 3 other systems. It didn't
You want
even
to talk
matter.
about the Turbo Graphics handheld that came out later? Or?
We could, but that was more or less like actual
Yeah.
console hardware.
Yeah,
being ported.
yeah.
This is essentially a Sega Master System portable. That's what this is.
Right.
But what was so cool about this was that you had a fully colored screen. It was lit so that you could actually play it. It's not the best screen in the world, but it did light up so you could play it at night, and it offered so many different features. The thing was, what Sega was trying to do with this was so different than what Nintendo was trying to do, and they simply didn't see the success they were probably hoping for. This system here was a little bit more expensive. It had a lot more features, but it also required 6 batteries. And and when you think about batteries, you think 6, wow, this thing must last forever. No. The Game Boy, even being an older system, even with its monochromatic screen, all that stuff, it still lasted longer on just 4 AA's.
Right.
But what mattered the most was that this system had a pretty cool library, but the Game Boy has a much better
It
one.
had a fantastic library with hundreds of games. We were talking about powerful systems a little bit in another hot take that we did. The Game Gear, way more powerful than the Game Boy. The Game Boy, it's dinky compared to it, but the software, right? The software was powerful. We had so many great games. I remember just my own personal games. Like I was talking about Metroid 2. It's wonderful. It's so much better than the original Metroid on the NES. Like it just feels like so much more atmospheric to me, more of a full package. Actually, I couldn't beat it for the longest time because it's very difficult, right? And it doesn't lend you a helping hand at all. But it also has like a part of it was just the fear because the minimalistic, like the Game Boy couldn't generate a lot of sounds. So like what they did with Metroid was like, oh, we'll intersperse a little bit of like sound effects here, a little bit of music there, but the lack of sound, they played that up in the game, and it sent chills down my spine. I remember when I got my Game Boy, and I believe it was in 1990. I got the original, the off-white colored Game Boy. When I first got it, I wound up getting the Ninja Turtles game, Fall of the Foot Clan, as well. Not a great game. But there's a bunch of other titles. I know one of our favorite ones is Donkey Kong 94.
Oh, this is
what
so
do you like
great.
about Donkey Kong 94?
I mean, for many out there that may not know, Donkey Kong 94 is... We call it Donkey Kong 94 because it came out in 1994, but this game was really cool. Personally, I prefer to play it on the Super Game Boy, which is the Game Boy adapter for the Super Nintendo that allows you to actually play Game Boy games on your television. But what was so cool about this game was, I think everybody saw it coming out and they were just thinking it's just going to be Donkey Kong, who cares? But Donkey Kong traditionally only has 3 or 4 levels depending on which version you're playing, but Donkey Kong 94 on the Game Boy expands with extra features, unique abilities, tons of more stages. It becomes a much bigger game. Mario moves in ways he never moved in the past, and it really becomes one of the best versions, in my opinion, of every Donkey Kong game that exists out there of the original style. Donkey Kong 94 is by far the best version they ever made outside of the original arcade release.
Absolutely, and it's probably one of the best games on the system, and that's saying a lot considering how like massive the library is and how many great games are on there. For me, like one of the biggest Game Boy memories I have, I may have said this on another hot take, so I'll condense it. I saved up my pennies and my nickels and quarters to get Pokemon Blue.
I did that too.
Because my friend was getting Pokemon Red. My friend Paul, if you're watching, yeah, man. So we would at recess time, we'd take our Game Boys out into the playground. We'd get our link cables and we'd be trading Pokemon and stuff. And just that whole experience, the fact that you could link up these devices, which weren't even released in the the 90s. They were first released in the 80s, like very late 80s.
Yeah.
Like that was insane.
Yeah, it was.
You could play multiplayer Tetris. Like, it was so cool.
Yeah.
So yeah, no, like my love for the Game Boy, like there's so many different levels, right? The library was huge, but it was also like just the fact that you were carrying those games in your hand.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? How many people have memories of taking one of these bricks, these olive screened bricks, and going on like a long car ride with your family? You know,
And not being able to play because you couldn't see the screen.
Yeah, okay, great segue. I wanted to talk about that. So I had what was called the nubby light. Yeah. So you would take the light and you'd slide it in like kind of over the cartridge slot, and then I think it may have taken 4 batteries, either 2 batteries or 4 batteries. I want to say 4 though, and yeah, that gave you some light for a little while. We didn't have the luxury of the back lighting that the later iterations of Game Boy systems had.
Yeah, it's just a thing you take it for granted now, but at the time, you just like I said, I had the Game Gear. I was used to being able to play games with like a screen that lit up.
Yeah.
But when you wanted to play Game Boy, and look, eventually with the Game Gear, it was cool and all. I do move to a Game Boy at a certain point because I had to. I had to play Pokemon. I had to play GoldenEye, or not GoldenEye, just James Bond 007, which was one of my favorite games on the platform. I wanted to play The Legend of Zelda: Link's Awakening, which is, by the way, a full Zelda game that happens to be on Game Boy, which I mean, the thought of that even happening is just crazy because they could take a game that was so big and stick it into such a tiny cartridge.
It was absolutely insane. And I think the fact that we're getting a remake of Link's Awakening very soon for the Switch speaks to the caliber of the game, right? It was another one of those titles, like I described earlier, where they were like, okay, we're going to bring this to the Game Boy, but it's going to be a little weird and a little different. So when you played Link's Awakening, yeah, the story wasn't the same sort of story that we'd be used to in a Legend of Zelda game. I know at that time it was still kind of up in the air exactly what they wanted the Legend of Zelda to be, but you also had like other characters showing up in the Legend of Zelda Link's Awakening. I think Kirby is like an enemy, and you had like the little like Goombas and stuff. It was very different.
It was neat,
but you know, absolutely deserves to be remade, and it's still wonderful. I went back to it maybe a year or two ago on my 3DS, and yeah, I played through it, and it's wonderful.
For me, when I think of the Game Boy in its early days, there was a couple of games that really stood out. So Zelda was a big one. Like I said, James Bond 007 was another one. But Pokemon and Game Boy Camera were my jam. Now, the Game Boy Camera.
Yeah, let's talk about it.
This is important. When Pokemon came out, it was massive. It was big. And I mean, I know we think about Pokemon being big now, but at the time, it was all-encompassing. For my friends in school that didn't have a Game Boy, they had Pokemon cards. For the ones that didn't get Pokemon cards and didn't have a Game Boy, they went home and watched the show. Everything would always be Pokemon-centric all the time.
If you had a Game Boy and you had the cards and you wanted to place the two together, you had the Pokemon card game for the Game Boy.
Yes.
You could experience Pokemon on any level.
And what happened was that at a certain point, Nintendo decided to do something crazy by releasing the Pokemon camera. Now the Game Boy camera.
Yeah.
Now why am I bringing up the Game Boy camera in relation to Pokemon? It's because when you got the Game Boy camera, this, by the way, was the first digital camera that anybody really saw.
Yeah, I believe it was in the Guinness Book of World Records.
Yeah, it was portable.
Yeah, it was like the smallest digital camera at the time.
Not a great quality camera, really wasn't.
You could take selfies.
You could take selfies. That was the first time anyone could actually do that. The camera was so revolutionary for its time.
Yeah.
But the thing was, if you bought the camera, you might have also wanted to get the printer. And the printer was this thing that worked off of like heat paper, so you didn't really need ink on it and stuff like that.
It's kind of like the receipt paper that some companies have at their registers and stuff. Yeah, so you can still buy that paper, but your mileage may vary.
Yeah,
because that it doesn't.
It might have gotten too hot over time.
The whatever, it's not ink, but whatever is being used on the stickers or whatever.
But that
really
printer you could also use with stickers and stuff like that. Yeah. But that printer worked with Pokemon, so you could actually print off certain things. So from what I remember, it's been so long. But that Pokemon, that printer, with the actual camera, you could take little pictures of Pokemon and post them into areas, and then just like, I caught a Pikachu while I was here, so you could take a picture of yourself in the area you were at while you're walking with your Game Boy where you caught your Pikachu and print that off. You could do so many weird things. Ooh. This is a Game Boy.
Yeah.
You could do this with something that was released in the 80s. It was insane that they kept releasing stuff like this.
Now that you mentioned the Pokemon thing, I kind of think, and if you're listening and you want to let us know, I kind of think you could print off your certificate if you caught all the Pokemon, because you do get a little like certificate at the end.
Might have been able to. Yeah, it was just to know they were releasing so many things that were connected with one another. The idea that you could go to actually exchange Pokemon with a friend was revolutionary for its time, and very few people even thought about that. Just to understand that we're talking about a system that transcends years, and the system itself doesn't really get a massive upgrade. The gray brick that everyone sees, that system pretty much stays the same for a while.
That's right.
There was transparent models that were released, thinner models.
Can I talk about these?
Go ahead.
So I had at least three. My folks may be able to attest to more. I lost, I think, one, my original off-white brick. I had a second one, which was from the Play It Loud series, which was like the deep black. It was this beautiful black console. I got really frustrated. I don't remember what game I was playing. I think it might have been Solomon's Key. I got really frustrated, and I headbutt the screen.
Oh.
It may survive the Gulf War. They cannot survive my skull. I broke that. I remember doing it just like, I was so angry, and then looking at it, and I was like, it's over. The relationship is over. And then luckily, I think it was like that Christmas or whatever, I got another Play It Loud Game Boy, which was the awesome, I'm so glad I headbutt that Game Boy. I'm sad at the same time.
I didn't headbutt this, and this one still works. So
I got the translucent Game Boy, the white one where you could see all the innards, and that was Play It Loud as well. And that one is super cool. You can still find those at swaps and stuff today, and they're really neat.
Yeah, I mean, look, when we talk about how good the Game Boy was and about all the things it did, it's important to know that this was hardware not trying to be like super powerful. This is hardware that was supposed to be long-lasting, durable, and just have a library unlike anything else. And for many people out there, I think the argument could be had that the Game Boy probably has one of, if not the best game libraries that Nintendo was ever involved in for any other consoles.
Well, some series were born there, right? We talked about Pokemon, but we can't forget everyone's favorite little pink. Well, he wasn't pink back in the day on the Game Boy. Kirby.
Yeah.
Kirby started on the Game Boy, and then he had the iteration of that title come to the NES very late in the NES's life cycle. But I remember picking up Kirby. I think it was Kirby's Dream Land. I remember seeing commercials for it, and they were trying to make him seem like super cool, and he was like eating like a Rambo dude and stuff. But he wasn't pink.
Yeah,
he was white.
And
he wasn't as angry.
Here's something to think about too. When you think about how long the Game Boy lasted, we think about the Game Boy Color, and the Game Boy Advance. Those are the big like iterations of the Game Boy's lifespan, right? And to know how powerful that brand was, you would assume that Nintendo would keep the Game Boy name going into the next generation of systems they would release. But when they released the Nintendo DS, they got rid of the Game Boy name.
No, they didn't do that without first saying like, "Oh no, it's fine. Game Boy will continue."
Yeah,
they didn't jump away from that.
That's true.
That goes to show how important the Game Boy name was to them. They're like, "No, we're going to test the waters for about a year, and then we can maybe wipe the slate clean." Once they saw that the Nintendo DS was taking off, then it was okay to get rid of that. Give the Viking burial.
The DS,
with the Game Boy Micro.
The original DSs had the abilities to run Game Boy Advance games on like the cartridge slot at the bottom. But see, a lot of people out there were really upset that they didn't call it the Game Boy DS or whatever it is, because they just like the name, the association of that. I know it sounds funny now, but when you think about how our parents would call video game systems, my mom would always call it the Nintendo, and any portable system was the Game Boy. It didn't matter what it is. And even the DS was the Game Boy for many parents going on, because it's just name association and brand association. And to know how crazy Nintendo was to just get rid of that name and make a whole new system shows you how confident they were in the DS.
Yeah.
And again, just what we saw with the Game Boy, what they did there, like I said, everything Gunpei Yokoi came up with that Game Boy translates into the next systems. When it comes to the Game Boy Color, it's much of the same idea, but now the screen's in color. When it comes to the Game Boy Advance, it's much of the same idea, but now it has more advanced features and eventually becomes backlit and even frontlit at a certain point. But when it comes to the DS, you'd think that maybe the Game Boy ideology and stuff gets left behind, but the DS utilizes technology that is so similar and easy to understand that to this day, the only thing that really changed was the Switch is really a jump to much more powerful hardware. It's using things that are so new and so advanced. But everything up until, I'd argue, the 3DS, every piece, every entry in that level in all their portables always had easy to use hardware, easy understandable stuff, and cheaper technology to make the GIST games work.
It's very interesting that you say that, because you can look at a lot of like the Game Boy's functionality carrying on to the other generations of handheld systems for Nintendo, but it's also the Game & Watch, right? Being incorporated into the DS design and 3DS design. It really goes to show you how much their legacy matters to them. Speaking of legacies and the Game Boy, Shane, how are we going to play the Game Boy in the future? What do you think? We had a hot take about a Game Boy Classic, and boys and girls, I really am starting to doubt that we're going to see a Game Boy Classic. If we were going to see one, we probably would have gotten an announcement sometime around now.
Yeah. The 30th anniversary would have been the greatest time to have that.
Yeah.
Look, I'm going to be fair about this. Seeing where the Switch is, I don't want Nintendo to release a Game Boy Classic. I just don't want that. The reason being is that when it comes to the other systems, they were systems you could play at home, and we wanted those abilities to be upgraded and stuff. With Nintendo, with the Switch, I just want Nintendo to make these games Switch accessible. I want to be able to just download all those games, buy them in packages, whatever it may be, even using their new their new storefront service stuff where you can just get the games through your Nintendo Online account.
It would be cool if they, if we didn't have to buy them. You're right. If they just had a Game Boy Online, just like they have the NES Online. Are there any titles that you'd like to see pop up on there other than the ones that we spoke about? I'm a big fan of the Mega Man games on the Game Boy. They kind of mixed things up. They took a lot of the bosses and levels from the NES titles, and then they had fun with them. Sometimes we had a mishmash of different titles together, and they played awesome.
Avenging Spirit is one that I'd love to see.
Yeah,
most people don't talk about that one, but it's a really cool one.
Nintendo knows what they have there, because every time you see a Game Boy integration into a handheld like the 3DS, like Avenging Spirit just kind of goes on to the storefront. Not a lot of people talk about that game, but it is a very good title.
For me, what I like about that entire library is that you're not only just getting Game Boy games, but you're also, if you really think about it, you get Game Boy Color games as well. They're a little bit more advanced, but there are games on that platform that I would love to see come back. For me, what I would love to see is, if you get Link's Awakening, I want to see a Link's Awakening of the original Game Boy version, and then the DX version on the Color, so that we can get both of those versions in one purchase, so that it can feel more like you have this kind of history thing. We're getting Link's Awakening on the Switch already. It would be so important to me if Nintendo just included the original 2 versions on the game, so that you could just go and play it. Look, we have... I know this sounds funny. I want to be able to play Link's Awakening portable on a real Nintendo system with a backlit screen, with like the original olive color, and I just want that. And I want the sides of the Game Boy, like the border of the Game Boy actually there, and I want the power light to be on, and then when the Switch is getting low in battery, I want that to blink. I just want that stuff.
If any company would do it, it would probably be Nintendo. Hey, how about Game Boy Joy-Cons to come with this thing? That'd be wonderful.
You could.
It's probably not going to happen.
You probably
They don't give us what we want Joy-Con-wise.
If we were to get something like that, it'd be really cool, because we could probably get a Game Boy style D-pad, maybe. That would be neat.
That would be so awesome.
To play some of those games, you need a D-pad. You really do, and I think that's something that they could add on there.
Yeah, I'd like to see Yoshi's Cookie pop onto that store. That's a little disjointed from what we've been talking about.
I'm not a fan of Yoshi's Cookie.
I like Yoshi's Cookie. I was trying to get you to play it. I was sneaking you into it. I was like, no, we'll play it like this. I think it's good. There's a really good version of Joe and Mac. Translation of Joe and Mac, the original Joe and Mac on the Game Boy that I really loved playing back in the day. There's so many good titles. There's like hundreds upon hundreds of games, and the bulk of them are good to great, I would say.
All you really need to know about the Game Boy, folks, for those of you out there that have never actually played the original Game Boy, it's a system that's old, really old, but there are a lot of other systems that came after it that haven't lasted as long as the Game Boy. And the Game Boy is still used in multiple instances all over, whether DJs are remixing songs with it, or you're seeing a whole bunch of people release homebrew games onto it, and so many other things. Yeah. We actually have seen this Game Boy hardware survive for so long that I imagine in another 30 years, they're still going to keep working just like they are now. They're so simple, they're so easy to understand, and they just keep working.
We're analogs making systems like the SG for the Genesis hardware that might be failing. I don't know that we'll ever need one of those for like a Game Boy, because these things seem to just work unless you're headbutt by Adam.
Yeah.
Then it's a,
Have you ever tried to headbutt a Switch?
I'll be right back.
Yeah. Okay. Well, folks, you tell me what you think about this, because honestly, I think this is one of the greatest systems ever made. Are you a big fan of it? What are some of your favorite memories of the Game Boy? Let us know.
Shane!